Welcome back, guys. So this is part 2 of the media planning module. Today we're going to look at those media objectives of reach, frequency, and weight. So specifying media objectives. What are some of the things we need to consider when planning how to spend the budget? One thing you'd want to consider is what proportion of the population you'd like to have exposed to your ad during a specific time period, and normally that's 4 weeks. So that's basically defined as reach, right? So what proportion of the population you want to have see your ad at least once. The second thing is, okay, what about the amount of times that that population might be exposed to your ad? And so this is the idea of frequency. And finally, if we combine the two things in terms of what total proportion of the target audience is exposed to your ad at least once, multiplied by the number of times on average that population gets exposed in terms of frequency, then you get something called advertising weight. And so that's the total advertising that that budget has been able, hopefully, to achieve. So reach is the first thing we're going to look into. As a concept, it's defined as the percentage of target audience that's exposed to the vehicles in which an ad may be inserted at least once during a certain time frame. And as I mentioned before, that's usually a 4-week or 1 month period. So it's representing the percentage of target customers who have an opportunity to see the ad message. So that's an important sort of note there, that when we have reach as a number, as a percentage of your target audience, it's only ever the percentage that may have seen your ad, not how many audience members actually saw your ad, or much less engaged with your ad, or in the best case scenario actually did what your ad hopes to make them do. So it's always important to take reach numbers with a grain of salt. It's only ever measuring the potential to see, or the potential to be exposed to an ad, not the actual number of people that see your ad. So ratings are a good example. You would think that ratings and reach mean the same thing, right? So if you've got a TV program, just hypothetically saying with 40% ratings, that means that 40% of the target population watches that TV show. And if you advertise in that TV show, does that mean your reach is 40%? Well, no, because reach is just the opportunity to see your ad if you place it in that TV show that happens to be watched by 40% of the target population. But in the previous lectures on media, we talked about how in any advertising, there's going to be, audience fragmentation, audience distractedness, audience people going off and doing something during the ad breaks, right? And so even though you're placing your ad in a very highly rated TV show or very well-read magazine, it doesn't guarantee that the ad will be seen. And even if we apply that to social media, right, you can place an ad and make sure it pops up in front of a very specific target market, but there's no guarantee that they will see that ad or that they will click through or even pay attention to that ad. So reach is not the same as actual ad exposure. It's just the potential to have your ad exposed to that target audience. So the audience numbers are one thing, but the reach might actually be 30% lower in terms of engagement with the ad. But in general, you can reach more people when the media schedule uses different media. So that makes sense. When we talked about audience fragmentation in the media lectures, we talked about how in the old days, if you had a really good TV show that had really high ratings, that was one way to almost guarantee that people will be exposed or have the opportunity to be exposed to your ad just by advertising within that TV show. But in this day and age, people are not watching TV as often as they are, and they are often, even when they do, distracted by other media. So you might be watching something on demand, but you might be sort of checking in on your Instagram account. You might be also attending to your email, doing an assignment. And so with that fragmentation, there's more chance for the audience to be distracted. And so advertisers respond by using multiple media, because the argument there is that if they're not paying attention to TV all the time, then by advertising on radio or on social media, that you can capture them or have the opportunity to expose them to your ad at any one of those various media channels. So using different media will help increase your overall reach. In other words, you're increasing the chance that the audience members will be exposed to your ad. Increasing the number and diversity of vehicles used. So that is, I guess, common sense extension from the previous point. You're using multiple media, but obviously using different types of vehicles within the same media, but also across different media, also increases your reach. And at some point, you have to kind of make the decision how important this mass reach actually is. As I mentioned before in the first lecture on media planning, it's really important to specify your target audience. And so if you have a very specific target audience, then you want to use as many different media and media vehicles to reach that target audience. But you don't want to go crazy and use vehicles that are of no relevance to your target audience, because that would amount to a wasted exposure and not an important exposure to an audience member that might actually be interested in your product or service. And finally, if you have a media schedule that diversifies its day part, so that means spreads out the ads throughout the day, then that obviously has the chance to increase reach as well, because the argument there is that an audience member may be paying attention to a particular media at one part of the day, but a different audience member may be paying attention to a different vehicle at a different part of the day. And so by spreading your advertising schedule across the day as well as across different media, that increases the chance to expose your ad to the maximum number of target audience people that you're interested in reaching out to. So here's a good example of how reach can be calculated. So this is a table from the Chitty et al. Asia Pacific edition textbook. Those of you with access to the textbook will be able to find this exact table. The number may have changed depending on the chapter it's in, but the information is pretty similar, and this explanation will help just to break it down a little bit. Right, so first of all, we've got the number of weeks down that left-hand column. As I mentioned, often media plans are measured on a sort of a 1 month or 4 week turnaround. So you've got week 1, 2, 3, 4, and a total down the bottom. And then across the top, you have audience members A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and J. So there's 10 audience members there just for simplicity's sake. So each letter represents a different audience member. So in week 1, we can see that audience person B and D and E and G and I are exposed. So that's 5 exposures in week 1. In week 2, only 1 new person was reached. So that's A, person A. In week 3, a different new person was reached or had the opportunity to be exposed to your ad, and that was person H. And then J was also exposed to your ad in week 3. And finally, in week 4, person F was the last person to be reached by your ad. And this is an ad that is consistently placed in the program CSI over a 4-week period. And so if we count up those numbers, you'll see that it's 9 of the 10 audience members that have been reached. 9 out of 10. So you'll notice that one person wasn't reached at all, and that was person C. And that could be based on this data that we're looking at, the fact they don't watch CSI, right? And so this goes back to the previous point about how if you diversify the type of media that you use, maybe person C was spending a lot of time on Instagram instead of watching CSI. And so if this media schedule also invested in Instagram advertising, then that increases the chance that the ad will reach person C because they're not watching CSI. But for the most part, positioning or placing this ad in CSI over this 4-week period amounted to a 90% reach calculation. So that's 9 out of the 10 people, so that's 90%. right? I mentioned C before about how that person is not reached, and hence the importance of making sure when you're planning your media schedule that you're not, you don't have gaps where potential target audience members may not be paying attention or maybe distracted and spending their time looking at other things or listening to other things. And that's why the importance of media planning, you're trying to cover all your bases to make sure that no person is left untouched basically by your ad. So frequency is the average number of times in that same 4-week period that the target audience can be exposed to your ad. And so once again, this definition doesn't claim to measure the actual exposure or the actual ad engagement. It's just the opportunity to be to potentially see or hear your ad. So those numbers down there are based exactly from the table before. So I'll just talk through them. So starting from the left-hand side, we see that 20% of the population was reached once, 40% was reached twice, 20% was reached 3 times, and 10% was reached 4 times. Okay, so one audience member in that group of 10 was very consistent in watching CSI every week, and therefore they had the potential to be exposed to your ad 4 times, right? So if you multiply those and add them together, you get this number 200. And that's important because that 200 is actually the weight, which we'll explain in a subsequent slide. But for the time being, we just need to know that 200 divided by the reach, which was 90% of the target audience from the previous slide, gives you this number 2.2. Right, so 2.2 is the average number of times during that 4-week period that members of the target audience were exposed to your media vehicle. So even though one person was exposed 4 times and 2 people were only exposed once, on average, after you put the whole lot together, it's 2.2 times, right? So on average, people saw your ad twice. So what are some marketing and media factors that influence frequency? In terms of, whether you try to increase the amount of time a person may see your ad or not, you have to take into account the brand history. Okay, and that's important because if your brand has a very strong history, then frequency might not be as important because the argument is that they already know about your brand. You're not trying to teach them anything new. Brand share is also important. So if you have a high market share, then you would argue that people are familiar with your brand, and therefore you don't need to keep hitting them with your advertising because you're just wasting exposures. Every time a person sees your ad, it already knows what you want them to know about your brand, right? You want to save that for either educating new people that don't know your brand to become aware of your brand, or targeting some other group to make sure that you're hitting them at the right time when they're just about to be in the market for your product or service. Brand loyalty, similar argument there. If your brand has a lot of existing loyalty, then once again the argument is that you don't have to keep telling them how good your brand is. They're obviously convinced already, and so you don't need to worry too much about frequency. The purchase and usage cycles, so this is talking about when a person might buy your product or hire your service. In terms of the product life cycle or the service life cycle. The argument being there is that if you have a product that is only purchased once every couple of years, then frequency is not going to be important because it doesn't matter if you hit the same person with your ad 20 times in a row within a 4-week period, if during that particular month they're never going to buy your product or hire your service anyway, right? And so this the information that you would have to make that decision would obviously be based on your existing database and figuring out when the best time to reach that person is, rather than dialing up frequency and just repeatedly exposing them to the ad when they are not within that window of opportunity to consume your product or service. Your competitive share of voice. So regardless of market share, how much advertising weight do you already have in that market? How much do they know about your brand? Once again, the argument there is the more they know about your brand, the less you can worry about frequency. If they know about your brand and they're still not buying your brand, then repeating the message over and over again may not be the best strategy. So maybe the budget that you would spend in terms of increasing the number of times you expose people to your ad, maybe that budget would be better spent on other things, such as a sales promotion, or maybe product development or service development, right? Because the argument there is that they already know about your brand. If they're not buying it, so you've got high competitive share of voice but low brand share, then maybe something else is going on, and increasing the frequency of advertising might not be the solution. The target group that you're targeting, so depending on the target group, you may or may not need to increase or consider decreasing the frequency that you're aiming for. So maybe some target groups need to be told multiple times for a particular message to sink in, whereas other target groups might get the message first off. And it also depends on the type of product or service that you're offering, right? And so usually the more complicated the thing you're trying to sell, and the less, I guess, understanding the target group is of your value offering, then the more times you need to try and hit them in order to convince them of your argument or your value offering. The competitive clutter within the market. So the more clutter there is, then perhaps the more you do need to increase frequency, because if you say what's good about your brand only once, but the competitor is saying how good their brand is multiple times, then you can see how your brand values might be lost very quickly. And so depending on clutter, you may want to increase the amount of frequency that you're exposing your brand to your target market. The editorial environment. So this is more specific to the magazine. Depending on the editorial content or the editorial environment of the magazine, if your product or service goes in line with the general narrative or the content that is already provided in that magazine, then you might need to say whatever it is you're trying to say less, because what you're saying is already in line with the general editorial environment of that magazine. If, on the other hand, you're trying to say something quite counterintuitive or goes against the grain of what's happening in that editorial environment, then you may need to repeat your message more often, because it's not going to be as easy to digest. And finally, attention. So the amount of attention that people may pay to your ad. This ties back with creativity, right? When we talked about how a good creative ad will automatically get attention. If you don't have a creative ad, then you are not guaranteed that attention the first time a person is exposed to your ad, right? Your ad won't turn heads, so to speak. And so therefore you might have to then rely on frequency, because the message that you're trying to deliver is not as compelling as it would have been if you had a creative ad. So a really creative ad you might only need to see once, and then you would remember it. A less creative ad might get lost in the clutter. It might be going against the grain of the editorial environment. You might have competitors with a larger market share than you. And so then in those circumstances, you can see how frequency becomes more important, because you're trying to repeat the message over and over again. So message factors and frequency. In terms of the complexity of the message, as I mentioned before, if you've got a very complicated story, then you may need to say it more often in order to get the full story to be interpreted correctly by the target audience. If your message is unique, then you may not need to increase frequency as much, because it'll stand out and people might pay attention to it. On the other hand, if it's too unique and you've gone too far the other way and you've tried to become a little bit too creative, then maybe they do need to see it more often, because the first time they see it, they just might be confused. So it's a bit of a sort of inverted U shape there, where if it's not very unique, then you might be lost in the clutter and you need to increase frequency. If it's too unique, it might be lost in translation and people get confused, and therefore you still need to increase your frequency. But if you get that right middle ground in that inverted, top of that inverted U, then the right level of uniqueness should get their attention and should minimize the requirement to increase the frequency of your ads. If it's a new versus a continuing campaign, so the argument there is that if it's a continuing campaign, there's already existing collateral and existing knowledge about that campaign, and so therefore frequency is not as important. If it's a brand new campaign, or you're rebranding your product or service, then you need to increase frequency because you're telling a whole new story, so to speak. And so it's better to do that correctly and with enough force the first time to make sure that people really get the idea before you can ease back. In one of the earlier lectures, we talked about the S-shaped curve in terms of the effectiveness of advertising spend, and we talked about how, you know, there's one theory that says if you spend money in advertising, you won't see any effects until you overcome some sort of resistance or some sort of middle hump, and then you see the return on investment. And so this is a great example of how, in order to get that frequency up, because you're launching a new campaign, you might need to spend quite heavily initially, and you may not actually see much traction because you're trying to re-educate your target audience in terms of what your brand stands for. And so it's important to increase the frequency in order to overcome that initial resistance to this new idea of your brand. Alternatively, if you're just continuing with a campaign, then the argument is that the ground foundation of your knowledge is there already, and so therefore you're not really teaching the target audience anything new, and therefore you don't need to spend as much on trying to get them to understand you over and over again, because they already do, because it's a continuing campaign. Whether you're going for an image sell, so trying to build the brand image, or if you're trying to sell the product attributes, that will also dictate the amount of frequency you want. So typically product attributes are much easier to understand because they're quite tangible. It's saying something like, you know, try this new razor, there's 4 blades versus 3. So that's pretty easy to understand. And if I see the ad once, I kind of get it. Versus building a brand image, that takes a lot more time and probably requires a lot more frequency, because it really takes, you know, it can take anywhere up to 3 years to really set a brand image in the minds of a consumer, so they really understand what your brand is about. And in those cases, then frequency obviously is more important. Message variation. So this ties back to the idea of IMC, or integrated marketing communications. Ideally, if everything is integrated, then everything is consistent and there is no variation, and therefore frequency is not as important, because whatever message they see across the various channels that you're trying to reach them in will have the same message, and therefore you don't need to repeat that ad as many times across the broad selection of media that you may have selected. On the other hand, if your message varies quite a lot across the various media, then you do need to increase frequency across the board, because every time they see your message, they're getting a different idea, and so that becomes very confusing. And so you want to minimize the message variation in order to minimize the amount of frequency you need to convey your idea. Wear out, so how quickly a person gets bored of your ad is also something to consider. If it's the type of ad that you think will wear thin very quickly, then increasing frequency is not a good idea, because you don't want people to get bored of your ad and then start to resent it. And in terms of something specific to either banner advertising and or newspaper advertising, when we talk about advertising unit sizes, this is the amount of space on the screen or on the page the ad takes up. So the argument there is that obviously it costs more for a larger advertising unit size, because that gets more attention. But conversely, the bigger the attention, the less frequency you need. Right? And so this is one of those balancing acts that media planners have to consider. Do you spend a lot of money and get a large advertising unit size, but you may only be able to afford to do that once? Or do you spend less money and buy a smaller advertising unit size, but you can maybe do that 5 times because it's a smaller unit? So what gets a better outcome? It's a difficult question to answer without knowing the creative content of that particular ad. So if you have one really good attention-grabbing ad and it's, you know, quite large on a newspaper or as a banner, then maybe that's all you need, and you only need 1 exposure. So you only need an average frequency of 1. And in that case, you can use the budget on reach and try and reach as many of your target audience members as possible once. Right? On the other hand, if it's not very creative or not very attention grabbing, then you might be better off trying to increase that frequency over the number of weeks more often, so that they see your slightly less impressive ad more often, and maybe the message will sink in that way. Weight. So as we mentioned before, weight is the combination of reach and frequency. And in the previous example with that table, the weight, the advertising weight, the total volume was 200, right? When we talk about weight, there's also three other ways to consider it. So one is gross ratings. That's what we're going to talk about next. But then there's also effective ratings and target ratings. So when we talk about gross rating points, or GRPs, this is just an indicator of the amount of gross weight, so the overall advertising that a particular schedule can deliver. And when we get a number such as 100, it can actually mean a couple of different things. So for instance, 100 GRPs could mean that you get everyone in your target audience once, right? But it could also mean, if we think about the combination of reach and frequency, it could mean you're reaching 50% of your audience twice. So that's a frequency of 2, but an exposure of only 50%. But when you multiply the two together, you still get 100, right? 100 GRPs. It could also mean that you only really expose your ad to 25% of the target audience, so a quarter of your target audience, but you do that 4 times. So 4 times 25 is still 100, right? So it really can mean different things, which is why it's important to figure out exactly how your gross rating points are made up. So if we go back to that example in the table, which is also in your textbook, as we mentioned earlier, the GRPs is 200, and that consists of reaching quite a large proportion of the target audience. So 90% of your target audience, approximately 2.2 times. But I want you to consider this scenario here. So using slightly different GRPs, we have, just for argument's sake, Media Plan A, which has GRP of 180. And we know that we assume that's made up of reaching 90% of the target audience twice, right? So this is quite similar to the other media plan that was achieved through advertising on CSI. But this is a different media plan. And in this particular case, you've got 180 made up of reaching a very large portion of the audience, but only twice. Now, if we compare it to Media Plan B, for hypothetical argument's sake, let's say that the GRP for that consists of reaching half the audience, so 50% of the audience, but doing so 3 times each, right? And so then you get a GRP of 150. So the question there then is, which plan is better? And the answer is that it depends, right? On the one hand, in Media Plan A, you're reaching a lot of people, but you're only doing so twice. In Media Plan B, you're reaching half the amount of people essentially, but you're doing so 3 times. And so that really depends on whether frequency is important to the media planner in this particular case for that particular brand, or if reach is important. If it's a product that, or if it's an ad that works well with a product in terms of reaching a large number of people, then Plan A obviously works better because you want to reach a lot of people, and maybe for some reason the advertising creative is very good, and therefore you can guarantee attention and you don't need to see the ad more than twice. So it's better in that case to prioritize reach. Get a lot of people to see the ad less often. Right? On the other hand, maybe it's a product or service that requires a little bit of explanation. Maybe it's a new story you're trying to tell. Maybe the target audience is much more specific. And so therefore reaching a smaller proportion of them, 50%, becomes more important. But when of the people you reach, maybe you want to make sure you get them as many times as possible. And so in those cases, the Media Plan B would be better, right? Because that allows you, on average, 3 chances to tell your story to a smaller group of people. The thing is, you can't normally have both. In order to get high reach and high frequency, you need a lot of money. And as we know, money is always a limited resource, no matter how big the company is. So one of the roles of a media planner is always to consider reach versus frequency. Moving on to effective rating points. So this is still a measurement of weight, but it's a slightly more finely tuned measure or conceptualization of weight. So ERPs is an effective measure of the media schedule rather than the total measure, which is what your gross rating points indicate. So effective measure considers things like how often members of the target audience have to see this ad. As what you're trying to do there is that make sure an ad doesn't reach members of the target audience too few or too many times, right? And this links to this idea of a 3 exposure hypothesis, or the 3 exposure rule. And that's the argument that on average you want to reach people about 3 times in order to get that message to sink in and to make sure that they didn't forget it the first time or the second time. And so what effective rating points does is that it reduces the entire number, or the entire metric, because it's only counting each effective rating point, which is it's only counting the occasions when your ad can be exposed to a target audience a certain number of times that is regarded as optimal for your particular ad message, right? So it's used to measure sufficient but not excessive media exposure. So you can see it's a much more conservative tool, rather than just looking at how many people you can reach and the average number of times. It's taking into account what you think the effective number of times is, and then adjusting the gross rating points calculation on that. So you end up with a much more conservative, but potentially a much more accurate and useful number. The other weight measurement is called a targeted audience rating point, and in industry this is typically what people refer to rather than GRPs. They usually just talk about TRPs, TARPs or TARPs, and that basically adjusts the gross rating to reflect just the target audience that the advertiser is specifically interested in. The way the measurement works out is pretty similar in terms of understanding what it means. So 1 TARP means 1% of the target audience, right? And so this number is always going to be lower than your gross rating point, because you're taking only a subset of the gross ratings, because you're only interested in the targeted ratings, which is a proportion of that gross audience that you're actually interested in reaching out to. So the calculation is still the same, the reach and the frequency, but obviously the reach becomes a smaller number, right? So if we take the same example as before, let's just assume that in the previous example of 90 being the reach number, maybe only 40% of that target audience was actually what the advertiser wanted to communicate with, right? 40%. So then obviously the TRPs is a much smaller number than the GRPs, which in the same example was 200, right? Because if you recall, in the previous example, we reached 90% of the audience 2.2 times, but with TARPs or TARPs, we're saying that only 40% of those people, or 40% of the total population, were of interest, were the actual target audience for this particular ad. And so therefore, when we work out the TARPs, it becomes a much more conservative number, and you get 88 TARPs rather than 200 GRPs. Right, so next time we're going to look at continuity schedules. So this is basically how budget is allocated over time, and this is based on which theory of advertising you subscribe to, whether you think advertising has quite a strong effect or perhaps only a very weak effect. That would then dictate, obviously, how important you feel it is as the media planner to allocate your budget across a certain time period. See you next time.